That'll be $60, sir. Oversized. Policy is policy. The words landed sharp and cold. The gate agent barely looked up, her tone rehearsed dismissive. Frank Connelly. 84 clutched his canvas duffel, hands trembling slightly. To the crowd, he was just another old man. But that bag carried a folded flag, a uniform, and memories of brothers lost long ago. I was hoping, maybe an exception, he asked gently. She sighed. Everyone thinks their bag's important. $60 or it doesn't fly. He hesitated. It wasn't the money, it was the quiet stripping of dignity. As he reached for his wallet, a voice rose behind him. Calm, steady, commanding. Do you have any idea who this man is? The airport fell silent, and in that moment everything changed. Frank Connelly moved slowly but with purpose, each step measured by experience, not weakness. At 84, his posture remained surprisingly upright, a quiet testament to years of military discipline that never quite left him. The fine lines across his face spoke not of frailty, but of decades of wind grit and honor. His gray hair, neatly parted, framed a set of calm eyes that had once scanned jungle tree lines for danger and now simply looked for his gate number on a departure screen. Frank was a veteran of the Korean War, one of the few remaining men from a conflict many today barely remembered. He never sought attention for it, never even brought it up unless asked directly. But this week was different. He was flying to Texas for a 70-year reunion, a gathering of the last living members of his old unit. They were meeting at a war memorial outside of San Antonio, near where their regiment had first trained in 1951. The thought of seeing those men again, or at least the few who still could, stirred something deep inside him. His olive duffel bag, worn at the corners, carried no expensive gadgets or travel gear. Inside were three things: a carefully folded American flag, the one they'd draped over his best friend's casket, a bundle of aged letters written to a girl he never married, and a velvet box containing his bronze star, still shining despite its age. Beneath those lay a pressed uniform jacket, the same one he hadn't worn in decades but couldn't leave behind. It wasn't just luggage. It was his history. Frank didn't like to ask for help. He never had. Even now, with the stiffness in his knees and the slight tremor in his right hand, he insisted on carrying his own bag. When someone tried to reach for it at the curb, he offered a polite nod and a simple, "I've got it, thanks." Not out of pride exactly, more out of habit. A quiet, stubborn sense of responsibility lived in his bones. He rarely spoke more than necessary, but when he did, people listened. There was something in his voice, not loud but steady, not commanding but impossible to ignore. Airport workers, Uber drivers, strangers in line, they always felt there was something more to him than met the eye. And there was. Frank Connelly wasn't flying to Texas for nostalgia. He was going for memory, for loyalty, for the ones who never made it back. He carried not just a bag, but the weight of names engraved on cold stone, and the promise he made in the mud of the Chosin Reservoir. If I make it out, I'll remember you. And he always did. Gate C-17 buzzed with the usual airport anxiety, too many people packed into too small a space. The overhead speaker calling out delays and last-minute gate changes, and travelers staring at phones like lifelines. But Frank Connelly stood quietly at the counter, duffel bag in hand, waiting his turn. "Name," the young gate agent asked flatly without looking up. "Connelly." "Frank Connelly," he replied. Agent Brianna typed with quick, mechanical taps. Her hair was tied in a tight bun, her navy blue blazer crisply pressed. But her tone was casual, almost bored. "All right, Mr. Connelly. One carry-on?" she asked, finally glancing up. Frank gave a small nod and placed the olive green bag on the scale beside him. Her expression shifted ever so slightly as the number blinked onto the screen. "You're over by 6 pounds, she said. "That's gonna be $60. Frank looked down at the bag, a flicker of hesitation in his eyes. "Ma'am, this isn't just a bag," he said gently. "I'm heading to a military reunion. There's some personal items in there." Brianna shrugged, clearly unmoved. "Sir, everyone says that. If I make exceptions, I have to do it for everybody." Frank gave a slight nod. "I understand. Just thought maybe—" She interrupted with a practiced smile. "Policy is policy." Behind him, someone sighed audibly. Another muttered, "Come on, old man, some of us have connections." Frank didn't respond. He just clutched the handle of his bag tighter. Then came a younger male staffer walking by with a coffee cup in hand. He paused just long enough to glance over the counter. "Overweight?" he asked Brianna. She nodded. "Well, rules are rules, Grandpa." He chuckled and kept walking. Frank didn't flinch, but something inside him did. He looked down at the bag again, hands trembling just slightly. Not from fear, not from anger. From memory. In his mind, the airport melted away. He was 19 again, boots soaked in slush, the wind howling through frozen mountain passes in Korea. Beside him, Private Tommy Reynolds had just stopped walking. Frank had yelled at him to get up to move, but Tommy never did. His eyes were wide open, snowflakes gathering on his lashes. Then came Sergeant Kelly, dragging a wounded man over his shoulder, his legs soaked in blood, still yelling orders through the crack of gunfire. And then the smell, the one that never left. Cordite blood earth. Back in gate C-17, Brianna tapped her pen on the counter. "Sir, card or cash?" Frank looked up. His eyes were distant but focused. "Those boys, they never made it back. I carry them with me. That bag, that uniform, it's for them." "I'm sorry for your service," Brianna said almost reflexively, "but it still doesn't change weight restrictions." Frank inhaled slowly. The air smelled of cinnamon pretzels and jet fuel. He reached for his wallet, carefully, slowly, a movement that felt heavier than it should. The line behind him shuffled. A teenage girl whispered something to her mother and rolled her eyes. A man in a polo shirt checked his Apple Watch and sighed loud enough to be heard. Frank's fingers found the leather edge of his wallet, but he didn't pull it out just yet. "I don't mind paying," he said, voice soft. "I just didn't think I'd have to explain why it matters." Brianna softened for a moment, then looked over his shoulder at the growing line and cleared her throat. "We just need to move this along, sir." And then the words that burned. "Maybe next time, pack lighter, Grandpa." Frank stood still. He didn't respond. Not with words. His mind flickered again. He was crouched in a foxhole. The sky above him crackled with distant artillery. In his hand was a letter from home unopened. He'd kept it folded in his pocket for weeks. A promise from a girl he'd never see again. He remembered saying to himself, "If I make it home, I'll never complain about the little things." And now here he was, being asked to defend a bag. A weight that didn't come from its contents but from memory, from loyalty. Back in the airport, Frank finally opened his wallet. He pulled out a card, slowly offering it to Brianna. She reached out to take it, but before she could, another voice cut through the terminal. Deep, calm, steady. "Do you have any idea who this man is?" Heads turned. Conversation stalled. The impatient crowd quieted. And for the first time, Brianna's posture faltered. Frank didn't move. His hand still held the card, but his eyes turned toward the voice. And in that moment, that precise, delicate moment, the energy in gate C-17 shifted. Because Frank Connelly wasn't just an old man delaying a flight. He was a man who had already survived more than anyone in that terminal could imagine. And he was about to be remembered. The noise of the airport faded into a low, shapeless hum. The blinking lights above gate C-17 softened, blurred by memory. Frank Connelly's fingers hovered over his wallet, but his mind wasn't in the present anymore. It was winter. Not this kind of winter with TSA lines and coffee shops, but a Korean winter, the kind that bit through bone and turned breath into frost in midair. He was 19 again, crouched in a shallow foxhole near the eastern ridge of the Chosin Reservoir. The wind howled like it had a personal vendetta. Ice crystals clung to the edges of his helmet. His rifle felt like steel wrapped in ice. Beside him, Private First Class Walter Lucky Hutchins cracked a grin, as if the freezing wind didn't bother him at all. Lucky had earned his nickname not because he dodged bullets, though he had, but because he carried a small tin of poker chips in his breast pocket, carried them everywhere, said they reminded him that life was just one big bet. That night, everything went to hell fast. A single pop, then a scream, then gunfire from the ridgeline. Muzzle flashes lit up the hill like lightning bugs. The Chinese had crept in close during the storm, waiting for the wind to cover their steps. Frank remembered diving, hearing someone yell, "Incoming." He hit the snow, hard-firing blind toward the tree line. Chaos swallowed everything. He turned to check on Lucky just in time to see him stand and fire 3 rounds into the dark, buying Frank just enough time to crawl toward the next cover. A shadow moved to Frank's left. He would have been hit square in the chest if Lucky hadn't thrown himself between them. The blast knocked Frank backwards, ears ringing, mouth full of snow. Lucky's body collapsed in a heap beside him, the poker chip tin torn open, its contents scattered across the white snow like a busted dream. Frank had screamed, pulled him close, but Lucky was gone, eyes open, blood steaming on the ice. They held the line that night. Reinforcements came at dawn. And when the sun rose over the hills, Frank knelt beside Lucky and made a promise with shaking hands. If I make it out, you're not being forgotten. Not ever. He carried that promise home. Through the silence, through the decades, through every reunion, every letter, every folded flag. Back in the airport, Frank blinked. The noise returned slowly, the beeping carts, the boarding calls, the buzz of passengers. But he wasn't the same. The duffel bag at his side didn't just carry medals and a flag. It carried Lucky, and all the others whose names were etched on black granite in D.C. and in his heart. This reunion in Texas wasn't a social visit. It was a mission, a final one maybe, because fewer and fewer chairs were filled each year. And Frank knew this time he might be the one reading the names. He looked down at his bag and whispered to himself, barely audible, "I haven't forgotten you, Lucky. I never will." Frank let out a quiet breath and looked down at his wallet, still half open in his palm. His hand trembled not with age, but with something deeper, something harder to name. Not anger, not fear, something more like shame. He wasn't ashamed of who he was. He'd lived with pride, with honor, with a quiet resolve that had seen him through decades of hardship and loss. But standing here at gate C-17, being nickel and dimed for a bag that carried memories heavier than the world, it chipped away at something sacred. The gate agent, Brianna, glanced toward the growing line and cleared her throat. "Sir, I need to process the next passenger." "Card or cash?" Frank swallowed and gave the faintest nod. "Card," he murmured. His fingers reached for it. The plastic felt foreign, cold, unworthy of the weight it represented. As he tried to slide it from the worn leather slot, the card caught on the edge. His hands fumbled slightly. The tremble became more pronounced. Not from arthritis, but from the degradation of being treated like a burden. Like just another delay in someone else's day. Behind him, a sigh. Another voice whispered, "Come on." The world around him narrowed to a pinhole, him, the bag, the counter, the cold voice in front of him. And then everything shifted. He didn't hear footsteps. He didn't see the man coming, but he felt it. The space behind him changed like the sudden hush before a storm. The energy dropped an octave. Brianna looked up, startled, her voice faltering mid-sentence. A man had stepped forward from the crowd, silent, calm, commanding. He wasn't shouting. He didn't need to. His presence alone was enough to pull attention from every corner of the gate. He was tall, broad-shouldered, dressed in a dark, sharply tailored civilian suit. No tie, no visible insignia, but his bearing, straight-backed eyes alert spoke of years in uniform. And when he finally spoke, his voice was steady as granite. "Do you have any idea who this man is?" The air changed, like a current had shifted through the terminal. Passengers who had been scrolling on phones now stared. Even the agent at the neighboring counter paused mid-scan. Brianna straightened. I'm sorry, sir. It's just our carry-on policy. His bag is overweight." But her voice lacked its earlier confidence. Her words stumbled. The man didn't even glance at her. His eyes were locked on Frank, softened now, searching. Frank turned slightly, squinting, confused. "Excuse me, sir?" the stranger said, his voice now gentler. "Might I ask your name?" Frank blinked. "Frank Connelly." A beat passed, and then the faintest flash of recognition lit the man's face. He took a step closer. "You served in the 27th Infantry, didn't you?" the man asked. "Korea." "Winter of '51. Frank's brow furrowed. "Yes, I did." The man's jaw clenched slightly, emotion barely contained. "My grandfather served with you," he said softly. "He told me about the man who pulled him out of a foxhole when everyone else ran. Said he owed you his life." Frank blinked. The memory, the screaming, the fire, the boy with the radio came rushing back. "I remember," he whispered. "Mason, he had a photo of his little girl sewn into his collar. The man nodded slowly. That little girl was my mother. He turned to face the gate agent, his tone suddenly icy again. This man doesn't pay a cent. Not while I'm standing here. And just like that, the silence deepened. What began as quiet humiliation had become something else. Something undeniable. The crowd stood frozen, their chatter silenced by the weight of what had just unfolded. The tall man stepped forward closer, now his calm presence radiating authority. But as he came into full view, Frank's eyes widened, not in recognition of his uniform, but of his face. Jonathan Frank's voice cracked. A question, a memory, a wound. The man paused, meeting his father's eyes for the first time in years. Yes, sir, he said, his voice quieter now. It's me. He was dressed in full Army service uniform, polished boots decorations, sharp against his chest. 4 silver eagles on his shoulders confirmed what the tone in his voice already hinted at Colonel Jonathan Connelly. He hadn't just arrived from the crowd. He'd come from Washington, D.C., stepping off a connecting flight moments earlier, and seeing this scene unfold from across the terminal had stopped him cold. Frank swallowed hard. His hand still hovered near the counter, the credit card forgotten. I didn't know you were coming. I wasn't supposed to, Jonathan replied. Briefing got canceled last minute. Figured I'd surprise you at the reunion. Guess the surprise was mutual. There was no warmth in his tone, but no bitterness either. Just layers, history, the complicated space between a father and son who had once gone years without speaking. Frank shifted on his feet. It's been a long time. It has, Jonathan said, his eyes scanning his father's face, older, now smaller somehow, but still solid. Behind them, Brianna, the gate agent, stood stiffly. Sir, Colonel, this passenger's bag. Jonathan didn't look at her. He raised a hand slightly, a gesture that silenced the whole gate. This passenger, he said slowly, turning now to address the onlookers, is not just my father. He's Sergeant Frank Connelly, 27th Infantry Korea. He served under fire at the Chosin Reservoir. He carried wounded men across the ice while enemy rounds cracked over his head. He earned the Bronze Star. He was cited for valor in 3 separate engagements. And he did it all, without ever asking for a thank you. The silence in the terminal deepened. Jonathan turned to his father again, voice lower now. You used to say I didn't do anything special. I just came home. But you did, Dad. You did a lot. Frank's eyes brimmed, though he said nothing. The emotion clung to him like frost, quiet and unmistakable. Jonathan stepped beside him now, gently lifting the green duffel from his father's shoulder. He held it with both hands like it was more than just a bag, like it was sacred. You carried all of us on your back for years, he said. Let me carry something for you for once. Frank blinked, his voice barely above a whisper. Thought you didn't want to talk anymore. Jonathan gave a faint smile. I didn't come here to talk. I came to stand beside you, Brianna stammered. Colonel, I didn't realize. You don't need to realize, Jonathan cut in cool and firm. You just need to respect. He turned back to the crowd. This man should be flying first class, but he didn't ask for that. He just wanted to carry his memories with dignity. Frank looked away, overwhelmed. Jonathan put a hand on his father's shoulder. You're not just my old man, he said quietly. You're the reason I wear this uniform. And for the first time in a very long time, Frank didn't feel like just an old soldier lost in a busy airport. He felt like someone seen, respected, and finally understood. The silence hung for a few seconds longer, thick as concrete. Then one by one, things began to shift. It started with the gate agent Brianna. Her earlier sharpness dissolved. She stepped back slightly, her hands falling to her sides as her gaze dropped from Colonel Connelly's face to the duffel bag in his arms. The weight of what she'd almost dismissed now pressed visibly on her shoulders. She opened her mouth, then closed it again, realizing there was nothing useful left to say. Kevin, the young man who'd made the rules our rules, Grandpa comment earlier, leaned slightly out from his post. His smirk was gone. He looked like he wanted to disappear into the floor. Next to him, Mr. Delgado, the supervising agent, who had earlier dismissed the whole situation, hurried forward now, tie askew trying to repair something he hadn't understood until too late. Colonel, he began nervously on behalf of the airline. I'd like to. Jonathan held up a hand, quiet but commanding. No apologies needed, he said. Just a correction. Delgado nodded vigorously. Of course. Of course. Then something rippled through the terminal. A woman near the front of the line, middle-aged, traveling with her elderly father, began to clap softly. It was slow, hesitant, but it spread like fire catching dry grass. A few seats over, an older man in a leather bomber jacket rose to his feet and added his hands to the applause, eyes fixed on Frank Connelly. Soon the clapping filled the gate. Passengers who minutes earlier had looked annoyed, frustrated, tired were now standing, applauding, some with tears brimming. Frank stood still, overwhelmed. He tried to shake his head to wave it off, but his son gently touched his elbow. "Don't brush it away," Jonathan whispered. "This is yours." From somewhere behind the counter, a young boy's voice rang out, pure, clear, and marveling. "He's like a real-life Captain America." The words weren't meant for drama, just honest awe. Frank turned to find the voice. The boy couldn't have been more than 9, wearing a faded backpack and a wide-eyed expression. He stared up at Frank like he was witnessing something heroic, because in a way he was. Frank managed a smile. It tugged at the corner of his mouth like it hadn't in years. He leaned slightly toward the boy. "I don't have a shield," he said gently, "but I did what I could." The boy's eyes sparkled. "That's even cooler." By now, other passengers had pulled out their phones, not to record a viral video, but to capture a moment that meant something. A memory to show their own kids. A story worth retelling. Airport security had appeared at the edge of the crowd, alerted by the sudden gathering, but when they saw what was happening and recognized the uniforms, they simply nodded and stepped back, letting the moment be. Delgado returned with a wheelchair, which Frank politely declined. Then he tried to take the duffel bag from Colonel Connelly to carry it on board himself, but Jonathan only smiled, shook his head, and gripped the handle tighter. "It stays with me." Frank was guided down the jet bridge with his son beside him, not just as a passenger now, but as someone honored. Brianna stepped aside as he passed. "I'm sorry, Sergeant," she said quietly. Frank paused. "You didn't know," he replied. "Now you do." And with that, he walked on head high, bag intact, memory restored. Behind him, the applause still echoed. But louder than that was the sound of dignity returning. Frank stepped slowly onto the jet bridge, the wheels of progress finally turning in his favor. But this wasn't just a boarding procedure now. It felt ceremonial. Colonel Jonathan Connelly walked beside him, not a pace ahead or behind, exactly in step. In one hand, he carried the olive duffel bag with the care of someone transporting a relic, not just luggage. In the other, he offered a subtle but steadying presence there, if Frank needed it, though he never asked. The flight attendants, already briefed by radio from the gate, stood at the cabin door as the two men approached. Their expressions were solemn, respectful. One of them, a senior attendant with graying hair, stepped forward and said softly, "Welcome aboard, Sergeant Connelly. We're honored to have you." Frank gave a modest nod. "Just Frank is fine," he murmured. But Jonathan interjected quietly and firmly. "He earned that title." The flight attendant smiled gently. "Then, Sergeant, it is." Instead of turning toward the rows of economy seats, they were guided to the front, first class. Frank hesitated. "I didn't book this." Jonathan didn't look at him. "Doesn't matter." When they reached the first row seats, Frank looked around with discomfort at the wide cushions, the polished armrests, and the champagne menus tucked into seat backs. This wasn't his world. He belonged in the back, next to the engine, the coffee cart rattling by every hour. "I should sit further back," Frank whispered. "You've already spent your life sitting in the back," Jonathan said, setting the bag carefully in the overhead bin. "It's time you sat in the front." Frank exhaled slowly and took his seat. As he lowered himself into the wide leather chair, a strange sensation settled in, unease mixed with warmth. The seat was too comfortable, too clean, but the pain in his knees reminded him maybe he had earned a little comfort. Jonathan sat beside him, adjusting his uniform with practiced precision. For a while, neither said anything. The plane hummed with quiet boarding announcements and overhead luggage thuds. The rest of the passengers were still filtering in, but first class remained a still bubble of calm. Frank finally spoke, voice low. "You always blamed me, didn't you? For enlisting." Jonathan didn't look at him. "When Mom died, I was angry at everything. But yes, I blamed you for leaving when I needed someone. For going to war instead of coming home." Frank nodded slowly. "I thought I was protecting something. Country honor duty. I didn't realize I was leaving a kid who needed his dad more than the flag needed another soldier." Jonathan finally turned toward him. You were always a soldier to me, even at home. Stiff, quiet, like you never came all the way back. Frank swallowed hard. That's because some of me didn't. They sat in silence again, but this time it wasn't awkward. It was healing. Earned. Jonathan glanced at the bag overhead. I saw the old letters in there, he said. From Mom, Frank smiled faintly. I never threw them away. Some things are worth keeping close. The engines roared to life outside the window. The plane trembled slightly, preparing to taxi. A flight attendant leaned in. Can I get you anything before takeoff? Frank looked out the window, then back at his son. I'm good, he said softly. I've already got everything I need. Jonathan smiled more to himself than anyone else. Outside, the runway stretched forward long, quiet, and clear. And for the first time in decades, so did their path forward. By the time the plane touched down in Texas, the story was already in motion. A passenger in the boarding area had quietly recorded part of the exchange at gate C-17, just enough to capture Colonel Connelly's words, the stunned silence that followed, and the moment Frank Connelly was saluted by the crowd. The video went viral within hours. News outlets ran headlines like "Veteran Humiliated at Gate," until a colonel stepped in, "Honor delayed, then delivered," Sergeant Frank Connelly's story. The airline responded quickly, sensing the wave of public outrage. By the next morning, they issued a formal statement. We extend our sincerest apologies to Sergeant Frank Connelly and his family. This moment has reminded us of the critical importance of honoring those who have served. We are implementing mandatory training for all frontline staff, focused on respect, sensitivity, and veteran awareness. But the story didn't stop with an apology. Colonel Jonathan Connelly, normally reserved and focused on operations, did something he hadn't done in years. He went public. In a heartfelt interview on national television, he spoke not only as a decorated officer, but as a son. My father never asked to be treated like a hero. He never asked for special favors. But he deserved dignity. Every veteran does. If we can't recognize the quiet sacrifices of the men and women who carried this country on their backs, then we've forgotten what they carried it for. His speech stirred something in the nation. Legislators reached out. Veteran advocacy groups began circulating new petitions. Within a week, the Department of Transportation announced a review of how airlines treat elderly and veteran passengers, beginning with carry-on exceptions for veterans with military honors. Frank, meanwhile, was still adjusting to the spotlight. He never liked fuss. He told reporters gently, I just wanted to get to my reunion in one piece. I didn't expect all this. But the response overwhelmed him. Letters came by the dozens, handwritten notes, printed emails, drawings from children, and thank you cards from fellow veterans who saw themselves in his story. Many of them started the same way. Dear Sergeant Connelly, I never knew you, but I owe you. One came from a woman in Ohio whose father served in the same division during Korea. Another came from a school teacher in Idaho who used Frank's story to teach her fifth-grade class about respect. Some letters made him laugh. Others made him cry. One short note written in pencil by an 8-year-old simply read, Thank you for being brave. I want to be like you. Frank sat on his front porch one afternoon, reading that card again and again. He didn't care for politics. He didn't crave recognition. But for the first time in a long time, he felt something return. Not pride, not attention. Something quieter, stronger, belonging. Frank sat on the porch of his modest home in rural Virginia, the morning sun warming the wood beneath his chair. The duffel bag was tucked beside him, same as always, its canvas still creased, but now treated with reverence by the world outside, not just by him. He ran his hand along the fabric absent-mindedly, thinking not of medals, not of uniforms or folded flags, but of the faces. Lucky, Mason, Sergeant Kelly. Men who didn't come home, and others who came back missing, more than limbs, missing pieces of themselves that never returned. He knew now more than ever that respect isn't something given because of ribbons on a chest or stars on a shoulder. It's something built from shared values, sacrifice, duty, humility. A quiet life spent carrying the burdens of others, even when no one's watching. I wasn't the only one who served, he said once to Jonathan. Your mother served waiting. Neighbors serve sending packages, and folks now, they serve in other ways. Not in trenches, but in how they treat each other. It made him wonder. How many people walk past us every day carrying stories no one asks about a janitor with a war wound beneath his collar, A grocery clerk who once patched up soldiers in a battlefield hospital. A bus driver who carried orders through enemy lines and now quietly drives kids to school each morning. The truth is, heroes don't always wear medals, and dignity doesn't shout. It waits patiently, hoping someone will look closer. So now we turn it over to you. Who in your life has a quiet story of service? A relative, a neighbor, a stranger you saw once do something quietly extraordinary. We invite you to share that story in the comments below. Let's honor those who never asked for attention, only understanding. And if this story moved you, if you believe that veterans deserve more than polite applause, that they deserve action, reform, and dignity, then hit the like button. Subscribe for more stories that restore what matters. And share this video with someone who might need to hear it today. Because remembrance isn't just a ceremony, it's a choice we make every time we see someone who gave and choose to give back. Thank you for watching. We'll see you in the next story.